You are listening to the Break Time Tech Talks podcast, a bite-sized tech podcast for busy developers, where we'll briefly cover technical topics, news snippets, and more in short time blocks. I'm your host, Jennifer Reif, an avid developer and problem solver with special interest in data, learning, and all things technology. I went from feeling that there wasn't much to discuss this week to feeling like I had a lot to say. I discovered something new about the Neo4j vector index this week. You can tell me if you think it needs updated as well. And then there was some recent confusion over not just the definition of MCP, but how it's used and why it's useful. This has me revisiting this topic a bit to give my take on the subject. Finally, I caught up on some content that challenges the way we think about vibe coding and RAG. Let's jump in. I was exploring more on the Neo4j vector index, creating a project that integrated with an already existing public database, a Neo4j graph database that I could access and utilize the data and the vectors that were already in there. However, I found that I couldn't figure out exactly what model was being used for the particular embedding field on the entities that I was looking to search. So for instance, I'm connecting via an app. Spring AI requires you to specify a model that you're going to be using for the embeddings, because if you send in a question and it creates an embedding using one type of model, but then you've created embeddings in your data set using another type of model, those two won't line up. You won't be able to do a vector similarity search on that. I talk about this in a previous episode of this podcast. I will try to link that as well, how you need to try to stay at least within the same model family, if not the exact same model, for when you embed your data and create the vectors, as well as when you send in questions and create embeddings for those as well. Spring AI requires you to specify a model, but I went out to the public database with all the data ready for me to use, and I couldn't figure out which model was used to create the embeddings in the data. I asked a colleague that I knew had helped and contributed in putting together the data, and was like, hey, can we figure out what model was being used just looking at the vector index? I can run a show indexes or show vector indexes in the Neo4j database and see the list of vector indexes, but I still can't see which model is being used. And the person responded that the only thing that you can see is the number of dimensions that are being used for the vector for the embedding. The number of dimensions, how long that array of floats is that's created for the vector. Now, this might seem like a pretty good indication. However, there are a few models that overlap. For instance, there's more than one model that uses 1,536 as the length of the embedding. This could be really confusing. Even looking at the dimensions, I wouldn't necessarily know exactly which model was being used. And also, it's a little bit cumbersome too to have to look at a number and try to either remember or do a quick search on which model uses this number of dimensions. When you create a vector index in Neo4j, you can set the configuration for the number of dimensions, as well as the similarity function that you want it to use, either cosine or Euclidean. As an example, you could create a vector index for a particular node or label on a specific property, and you could set some index configuration for the dimensions and the similarity function. However, nothing else gets set when you create the vector index. So then after you create it, you could do a show vector indexes yield star. If you just show vector indexes, it'll show basic information about the vector index. But if you yield star after the end of that show vector indexes, it'll pull back everything it has on the vector index, but still you're only getting the dimensions and the similarity function that you've set in the configuration. You're not getting any extra data on that. This would be nice to add when you create a vector index, at least in Neo4j, to include the model as well, so that somebody who may not have created the data in the database and is not intimately aware of how it was done could still figure out the information they need in order to connect applications to it. I've recently discovered there's some confusion around model context protocol. Now, I think a lot of us know what model context protocol is, at least the general definition of it, but how does it actually function within a generative AI system? And I have mentioned this before on the podcast, but again, I've had a little bit of recent confusion, and I wanted to discuss a little bit better here now that I have a better understanding of it as well. I've started thinking of an MCP server like a microservice, where you've bundled up a set of functionalities and created an entry point or more for an application to access that information. As an example, you might want to create a customer API that can retrieve customer information, things like recent orders, contact information, and location. However, you might not want someone to access the amount that customer has spent with your company or any PII, personal identifying information, that's associated with that customer account. Instead of creating a database role for an application that locks down certain fields, but allows that role to access the database however they see fit, you might create a microservice, something like a mini application, that sets up an endpoint or two that pulls basic customer information and recent orders. This provides a defined path into the data without trying to limit the flooded access that you might have to do with a database role. It also makes the microservice very modular and consistent. Different projects or applications don't have to craft the exact same queries to retrieve customer information. They can access the predefined service that's already available that will give them what they need. I also have another example. I'm a parent of young kids, so instead of providing a whole snack cabinet for the child to choose from to pick a snack for the afternoon, you could offer a choice between 2 or 5 or 10 or however many options you want to, and let them pick from that list. It provides some set of limitations while also giving some options and some flexibility there. MCP is a service or a tool for a large language model to access system resources in a consistent and predefined way. The large language model doesn't need to craft a query to a database, which potentially could be inaccurate or access information it shouldn't have access to, but instead use an existing tool that is provided to it. This combination proves powerful and customizable with large language models and MCP. Neo4j and so many vendors will offer verified MCP servers that you can integrate into your project. Think, instead of creating a custom integration to pull recent listings, whether that's projects, customers, what have you, you use a trusted MCP server to access those predefined methods that the vendor has already set up. You can also think of MCP servers like Docker containers that are provided by vendors. They are trusted bundles of technology that you can spin up and work with out of the box. Again, providing simple, basic entry points that you can access and utilize the information the way you need to. I'll provide a link to Neo4j's MCP servers. There are several now, and they provide a lot of different options for ways you might want to connect to Neo4j and use the data within it. The content I want to talk about, there are two different things. The first is an article called From Gimmick to Game Changer, Vibe Coding Myths Debunked. This is from my colleague Michael Hunger, and I really liked the exploration here of looking at vibe coding as a tool in your toolbox, but also needing to set up some sort of boundaries and guidance for how to use it well. Vibe coding often gets a bad rap. There definitely do need to be some guardrails and processes put in place around it, but it also opens the door to opportunities that never existed before. There's a couple of brief things I'll cover from my own experience. I was asked a few weeks ago to step in and cover a workshop that was based on a Python project. I'm not a Python developer, as many of you might know. I'm a Java developer by trade. I needed to come up to speed on some of the Python things and tweak a few things for some of my preferred approaches to instruction. I was able to go in and with some coding tools, was able to adjust things. I focused on what it was I wanted the attendees to get out of the training or how I wanted to present the information. And I let the AI coding tools decide what that Python syntax needed to look like. Another option is looking at media content. For instance, video and podcasting tools, where I'm able to produce content without learning all of the ins and outs of media and video and audio editing. It allows me to participate in certain ways that maybe I couldn't before. Now, not to say that I'm not learning the ins and outs as I go along, but it definitely sets me up for better success in the long run because I'm able to get off the ground and running faster by incorporating some of these tools from my tool belt. The article goes into how business users might not have been able to explain their business requirements in a technical environment, or might have had to deal with multiple conversations back and forth to produce what they were actually looking for. Now, with some of these generative AI tools, they might have a seat at the table to help create better quality proof of concepts or visuals that can better communicate what's needed and what the results should look like. Also, think about those in communities who might not have some of the resources that other communities might have. Think levels of instruction, technology, expertise, finances, formal programs, now might have access to learn and explore almost anything with a laptop and a few LLM credits. The article also digs into analysis of risk mitigation versus risk avoidance. If you think about the major changes that have happened to society over time, things like going from horses to cars as modes of transportation, land to air travel, even letting kids try something new, or any major change in society, there are ways to approach each of those things that can help minimize risk, or at least not let you take risks unnecessarily. And that's a wiser approach that we should also take with AI as well. We can incorporate how can we minimize the risk or make the outcomes potentially less painful by setting up some guardrails and some good processes that help us use it safely while still helping us move forward. The first point in the article talks about something that I mentioned earlier in regards to this article, and it's where you can focus on the goals of what you're trying to do versus how to do them. Oftentimes, as a developer, I feel like I spend a lot of time fussing with the syntax or clean code or getting something just to work, when it would be a far better use of my time to focus on how the process should flow or the objective that I'm trying to get on the other side. I think this is also a really good case for the AI tools and integrating them into our workflows, because we can focus on the goal and let these tools help us provide the syntax and the specific steps along the way. The other piece of content I came across was a YouTube video from a colleague and former colleague of mine, Will and Adam, and it's a live stream called "Rag Was Fine Until It Wasn't." I found this really interesting because it's showing a real-world use case on the progress of the solution behind the Neo4j Graph Academy online training platform over the course of the last several years, going from non-generative AI solutions to now incorporating generative AI and using it to help people and developers specifically learn technology better. It uses data points and feedback to help influence the opportunities and the way that they have designed and built the system over time to provide some really unique, custom-built training opportunities for people coming in and trying to learn Neo4j and graphs. So if you're interested in something like that, I would highly recommend you check out the live stream. I will link the recording in the notes. From vector index features to metaphors that help explain Model Context Protocol, or MCP, I hope you enjoyed this week's dive into what I've learned. As always, thanks for listening and happy coding.